Hi everyone, come on in. Thanks for joining us today. This is our panel on CMMC, or the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. I just kind of want to get a read of the room before we start. Can you raise your hand if you do business with the DoD? Phenomenal. And can you raise your hand if you are aware of or going through the CMMC? Excellent, a very knowledgeable audience. This makes our job a lot easier today. Thank you. Well, just, a quick refresher, and I'm actually not going to go through the levels since you all seem to already know this, but this is the new DoD Cyber Certification, and it's really meant to implement a unified cybersecurity certification for companies that do business with the federal government. We expect this to probably move to civilian agencies. We've seen it as potential requirements in some GSA vehicles already. But basically what it means is that if you do business with DoD, as you are all aware, that means that you need one of the 5 levels of CMMC. So I'm going to skip over what it is since everyone already knows, but today we're going to talk with our panelists about a couple of things: what industry is doing, what government's doing, challenges they're facing, and kind of what you can do to be prepared. I have Q&A for them, but I also want you all to interact with us and talk to us and ask your questions and share your feedback. So let me do a quick introduction of our panelists. Kyle Beagle is the Associate Director of Small Business Programs at the U.S. Marine Corps Systems Command. He has a tremendous amount of experience in federal acquisition. It's really an understatement. He's served as a contract specialist for the Army, Naval Facilities Engineering Command, and Marine Corps Installation Command. Kyle has also served as a Small Business Program Manager for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and prior to his current role, he was a Procurement Analyst and Deputy Director of Small Business Programs at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Fantastic. John is someone you also heard from and will continue to hear from this conference. I'm going to introduce him again like I got to introduce him this morning. He is a partner at Polaro Mazza PLLC, where he serves as chair of Polaro Mazza's Government Contracts Group. His practice focuses on helping firms with a diverse array of federal acquisition regulation compliance issues, including extensive counseling on the federal procurement programs for small businesses. John is a ROC and HubZone Council board member, and he recently testified in front of the House Small Business Committee on a hearing on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And my final panelist is Michael Dunbar. He is president of Rishka International. You'll see they have an exhibit table in the main hall. They are a HubZone certified company that provides lubricants and fuel oil to the federal government and commercial and maritime industries. Michael is a veteran of the U.S. Navy Nuclear Power Program and a service-disabled veteran. After years of working for others in the biotech industry, Michael decided that it was time to branch out on his own, be his own boss, and thus Rishka International is the result. He also testified recently on behalf of the HubZone Council at a House Small Business Committee hearing on CMMC implementation and what it means for small businesses. To introduce myself, which I realized I didn't do, I am Elizabeth Sullivan. I am president of Madison Services Group, and we have the honor of representing the council as part of their federal advocacy team in Washington, D.C. So thanks so much for joining us. I figured, we'll just kick it right off. John, I want to start with you. I want you to kind of give us a sense of where we are in the process. I know there have been a lot of moving parts with CMMC, with the change in administration. The DoD has been doing an internal review. I'd love for you to just give us an overview of kind of where we are now.
Sure, yeah, thanks, and glad to be here. So, I think we are really not very far from where we were when Michael and I testified a couple months ago, and that's really maybe one of the real stories about CMMC is sort of the pace at which it's being rolled out. We're several years into the initiative at this point and still don't see the finish line. Maybe it's a little bit closer than it's been, but still hazy, I think, off in the future. They're still working on the final CMMC DFARS clause. We've had an interim final rule since towards the end of last year. There is this review that Congress asked them to undertake, and at the same time, the Biden administration put out an executive order addressing cybersecurity issues, and I think there have been some questions raised about what's the Biden administration's perspective on the CMMC rollout, and do they have their own designs on that? So there's still more questions than there are answers, I think, is the bottom line.
I think that's a really fair way to put it. DOD undertook this without congressional direction. Usually when you see something of this magnitude, it's something that Congress directed them to do and they're implementing. But in this case, DOD's Inspector General did a report basically looking at contractor compliance and saying, were contractors complying with the DFARS clauses as existed already and the NIST guidelines? The answer was overwhelmingly no. And so that's really what prompted DOD to take their own actions starting in, was that 2017? Is that when they kind of started this train rolling? Which has been an interesting, from our perspective, type of timeline. It's been an interesting thing to also try and influence and change and bring awareness to, because initially Congress wasn't doing that much oversight over this program, while we had numerous HUBZone companies coming to us screaming, saying, this is what's happening, this is gonna put me out of business, I need to tap out the federal market. And so that's kind of where we have been with working on this issue from a federal policy standpoint.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to, I don't know if anybody in the audience would co-sign this comment or not, but I think it's hard to really grab HUBZone firms' attention on this issue when there are still so many questions and it seems so far off in the distance. I mean, we've been kind of beating the drum about this in the small business community, the council and others for a few years. But it's hard, I think, for the business owners to really grab onto it when we still don't know where you're going to get certified, how much is it going to cost, how long is it going to take, when are you going to need it? The key questions, there still aren't answers to. So I think that certainly the proactive folks and all the hands went up are already starting to prepare for it. But I wonder how it's impacting maybe the broader small business community in terms of the preparation they're doing and how they're approaching it.
Absolutely. Yes.
So the CMMC has a really fuzzy finish line, but the DFAR from 2015 did not. And so we're seeing a lot of the primes going out to these small companies saying, have two-factor authentication done by next week or no more contracts for you.
Yeah, the relationship between primes and subs, that's really where it's at right now in terms of enforcement of the cybersecurity requirements. You're absolutely right. I mean, we've seen some primes say, you've got to have cybersecurity insurance if you want to be on our team, and you need to...
You're not going to be able to afford that next year, by the way.
Yeah, so I think that's really the first wave of it that's happening right now. I agree, while on the government side, maybe that's still taking more time.
Is that by design? The fewer small businesses they have to deal with, the better off they are?
No, that's not the design. I think that DOD just basically said, we don't have consistent cybersecurity. We know that this will probably knock off some businesses. I don't think that they anticipated it knocking off as many as kind of are predicted. But I know that the core of the idea was we need a more unified cybersecurity certification across government, which actually, Kyle, I was going to ask you, we hear a lot on our end, right? We're always talking about industry. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, how is the agency preparing? What's your experience?
So we've been
love you to elaborate.
in this environment for since roughly a little bit around 2018 timeframe when we started putting the NIST information, a lot of the contracts and having the NIST requirements. So that's kind of where a lot of the large businesses are drawing down that, because that's affecting their contracts at that level.
Right.
So
Right.
they need to say, hey, subs comply, because the CMMC thing is affecting multiple tiers of supply chain, and it's not just tier 1, tier 2 anymore. It's tier 7, 8, 9, tier 25 sometimes. And who the heck knows who tier 25 is? So that's really what you got to be in there. Just to give you guys a little bit of a foreshadowing, I know on the 16th in the virtual part, if any of you are taking that, I've got a counterpart of mine who is our cyber guy, Mike Cirillo. He's going to talk more in depth to some of the in the weeds of CMMC and some of the more cyber technical aspects of it. But you want to be aware of that. They're not trying to eliminate small business by any means. They still want to have the innovation and the agility they get with small business. But at the same time, they also are cognizantly aware of what's happened in the cyber and the other marketplaces where, unfortunately, the small has less funding to devote to a cyber metric in a lot of cases unless that is their core industry. So they are the easy attack vector in some cases is what can be a concerning factor. So that's something that is playing out in a lot of discussions. They are currently working on a Project Spectrum to help a lot of businesses get the certifications and everything and get those third-party certifiers out there and get into that arena, even though it is moving at a snail's pace in some cases, for lack of a better way of putting it. I hate to say that, but it should have been further along by now. And the recent cyber attacks that happened earlier in the year and the Biden administration's executive order are playing a role into driving that path forward as well.
Absolutely. And Michael, I know from a business owner perspective, you've been entrenched in CMMC. In your testimony, you kind of outlined your biggest concerns. I'd love to know, one, kind of what your biggest concerns are at this point. Have they changed from a few months ago? And two, what your thoughts are on the pause that DoD took to, look at CMMC and where they're at.
I think the biggest concerns that I'm seeing, come to, I think, all of us is cost. And something I sort of was thinking about in describing CMMC, and I sort of called it the hippopotamus and the hummingbird. And basically, CMMC is sort of like a watermelon. Go to the zoo, they feed the hippopotamus this big old nice watermelon, and it swallows it and it's happy. Those are the big contractors that are out there, the primes, they can go ahead and afford this. Small contractors, we're the hummingbird. We got to take care of that little nectar inside, but the problem is they throw the watermelon at us, we get squished. I mean, there's nothing else in there. There's no way for us to afford that kind of financial wherewithal. The estimates that I've been given for my 6-person company were in excess of $100,000 to put in a level 3 CMMC package. It was in excess of $100,000 to go ahead and put in the assessment package that was required. I said, that's $200,000 for a 6-person company.
That's 40 points on your overhead.
A lot more than that. So it's an ugly number, and that's, where do we come up with that?
Right.
That's my biggest issue. What they're doing is they're taking that watermelon and making that the solution for everybody. We don't need the same solution for everybody, and I think that's where the next phase comes in. Small businesses like mine, we don't handle CMMC. We're mostly COTS, but if there were CMMC, we'd have to go through, CUI, we'd have to go through and handle it in this new designated manner that CMMC has. Whereas they could create an enclave, a walled garden, whatever you would like to call it, where we could reach in, do the paperwork CUI behind a wall, come back out, and we're done. It's all protected. The DoD controls it, has it. We don't need to have all that stuff done at our site. And the cost savings there are tremendous. Now, that doesn't work for every company, but there's probably 20% or 30% of the companies out there that handle paperwork CUI, not manufacturing CUI. And those, we can take this off in pieces. We don't have to go ahead and have a one-size-fits-all. I think that's really where this needs to shift and move to, is recognizing maybe the various different levels of company having different levels of how you need to access and have CUI or CMMC controls.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, I strongly agree with that. And I think what we need to try to do for the small business community is structure it so that as many small businesses as possible don't need higher than level 1. Level 1 is the basic safeguards that as a federal contractor you already have to comply with. So if you could access the information, the more sensitive information, you need to do your contracts through a secure enclave or some other means where that information doesn't have to touch your network, there could be a significant cost savings as a result of that because you would not need a level 3. That won't work for all contractors. In some companies, what you do, this is going to be a necessary investment to play. And it's a privilege to do business with the federal government. It's not a right. So there are some things you're just going to have to spend money on, and for some firms that might be a discriminator. They may no longer be able to play because of the cost or because of other factors. But ideally, we should be aiming at keeping that group as small as possible, and hopefully more firms at level 1. We could be creative in how we handle the more sensitive information so that we can minimize the companies that have to make that 6-figure investment.
I think the other thing that goes in with that, though, too, is there are no guardrails preventing the primes from saying, you got to be a level 3. We don't care. We're not going to do business with you unless you're a level 3. So too bad, go spend the money, or we won't do business with you. That's an issue that definitely needs to concern all of us, because if you're a COTS supplier, why do you need to be a level 3? According to all the paperwork right now and the presentations, COTS are exempt. I actually recently saw NavSup had a requisition go out for a COTS item, and in there they had a CMMC requirement. CMMC doesn't exist yet as far as contracting goes in the government, right?
Exactly. CMMC does not exist as far as contracts go. The two things that do exist is the NIST requirements, and also with the recent executive order from the Biden administration, there is a trial period being done for a national security exemption in relation to certain types of contracts where they could limit the field in those environments. But right now, a lot of agencies are just kind of in early talks on how do we pilot this and what will this do to our competition base if we need to utilize this methodology to do a contract that's not quite in the black side, but is still in a sensitive environment, so to speak.
I know that it's been a challenge that's been raised to us many times, which is how is the level going to be impacted for subcontractors, right? So our prime's just going to say, well, to cover us and it's easiest, you need a level 3. We had initially 2 years ago asked the DoD this question, and it had been that they were going to set the level for subcontract work, and then it had changed to that they were going to work with the prime to then figure out what level all the subcontract work has been. But I feel like it shifted back the other way. Kyle, do you have any insight on that?
Not much on that. What I can say is the reason why the feeling is there it would be set at the prime level is because a lot of times the mapping, depending on how complex the contract is, you don't know how far it goes. And if you wind up with a COTS vendor as one of the subs, that's where the questions come into play, because if you set, oh, we want you to be CMM level 3, just for example, at the top level, because the contract in and of itself is not COTS. But if they're building a GOTS product with simply a COTS add-on, you could run into that issue very easily where, okay, the prime needs to be certified, but how I would see it, you should say the prime needs to be certified to maintain the information and say, but the sub, if they are working in this arena, does not necessarily need to, but then you add burden to the prime to manage and admin that piece of it. If you just say, everybody and their brother needs to be it, the admin costs are a little bit lower because you're just directing everybody do it and make the investment. But it is very much a challenging cost as you get to smaller size companies. So I think that's something that's still got to be played out and ironed out by a lot of the agencies drawing a policy on it.
Yeah, I mean, the interim DFARS clause that exists for CMMC, I mean, there is no CMMC certification now, but there's a clause for what it would look like in your contract when that comes to pass. And it says that for flow down to subcontractors, it's up to the prime to decide. Right. And I guess maybe that's the best they could do with it. What I would like it to say is a little bit differently, that the prime is prohibited from flowing down any higher level than the minimum level needed for the work being done by that subcontractor. Right now, it says it kind of the same thing, but from the opposite perspective, that the prime will decide what is the appropriate level. And I think, if you put your prime hat on, I can understand their perspective, why the risk that they are taking under a contract that the government assigns level 3 or higher, they're going to have to think hard about assigning less than a level 3 or higher to their subcontractors. As Kyle said, there's a significant focus on supply chain risk, supply chain transparency within DoD and broader government right now. So I think you have to put yourself in the prime shoes and appreciate that that's not an easy decision for them to make. But I think we could take that decision maybe a little bit out of their hands if the DFARS clause prohibited them from flowing down higher than the minimum level necessary. I think the reality is, and this probably sounds, it's one of those like easier said than done, John, but it's going to come down to the individual negotiations between primes and subs, and small business subcontractors are going to have to try to find, and that's going to be easier said than done in many cases, the leverage needed to push back when the prime insists on a higher level than is necessary. And it would be nice if we could involve the contracting officers. Like right now, contracting under the 7012 clause, a sub can involve the contracting officer when there's a question about whether that clause should be flowed down to the subcontractor. It'd be nice if the same type of mechanism existed so that you could have essentially an arbiter in the form of the CO say, no, prime, you shouldn't be putting a level 3 on this. They're going to be doing COTS or whatever it is. Go with a level 1.
And if given the option, they are going to go, because I don't know how many contracts I signed that I have the exact same liability amounts as the prime contractor does. Because if they have a $5 million, they have a $35 million contract with $5 million in liability. I have a $35,000 contract with $5 million in liability.
Yep.
And
They want to
50
go.
other contracts.
What's that?
And 50 other contracts.
And 50 other, exactly.
I do want to get on that point of cost, but I also saw a hand in the back.
So, my name is Irene, I'm working for a company called H2O Solutions, and I guess my question really from the contract side of the house is, we are seeing in, I'm trying to say this right, RFPs, we are seeing some of that language, the CMMC language, and so a lot of our small businesses are unsure of what they should do. Should they go ahead and implement everything for 171? Should they do a level 1 for CMMC? Should they think that they're going to have CUI and just do a level 3? What would your recommendation be on that if you're able to speak to that?
Well, I'm happy to take a stab and others guys jump in, but I mean, a couple recommendations. All small businesses that are participating in the defense industrial base should be preparing for level 1 at a minimum. So I think if they're in your ecosystem, tell them to get level 1 ready. These are things that they should already be doing, even if they're not DoD contractors. It's in the FAR. It's basic blocking and tackling that, frankly, even if we didn't have the FAR, you were just in the commercial space, you'd want to be doing these things as a business in this day and age. So I think that's one, bare minimum, get level 1 ready. And in terms of the solicitation requirements, just be sure the way that they're written, what the requirement actually is, because nobody can impose upon you to have CMMC at this point. There have been some civilian procurements, like the GSA contract that Lizzie mentioned, and I heard that the GSA Polaris contract is going to have this as well, where they're expecting you to write to sort of an internal assessment of, are you going to need it, what level are you going to need, and what's your plan for getting there? So, I mean, you should be doing all of those things if you're in the defense industrial base already anyway, to decide whether you're going to need more than a level 1. Because you won't just be able to wake up and go get it tomorrow once the certifiers open their doors. There will be advanced planning that's needed for sure.
Kyle, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, and just like you said, the CMMC is not directly in the contracts. The NIST 171 is in some of the contracts, and that is what where they would need to start complying as far as that goes. Now, they should be preparing for level 1. In the case of a GSA or outside agency contracts, if they are something the DoD uses as an ordering vehicle, I could see there being reasoning why they would want that. That way the ordering vehicle stays viable for DoD to utilize, because if the ordering vehicle doesn't have that language in there, all of a sudden, whenever this stuff goes into full effect, it becomes no longer viable. So
Got it.
that is something to be aware of.
Thank you. Michael, did you have something to add on that?
Yeah, I think it's just, 800-171 is the current law of the land. And that's really where we need to make sure we're meeting that level currently. Everything else beyond this, is hypothetical, but realistically, level 1 it's not hard. And it's weird because, I come from 2 years ago when I first got involved in this. I thought, hey, my ISP says they have security, great, Xfinity's got me covered, oh, hey, I've got Bitdefender, okay, yeah, we're good, we're golden, I don't need anything else. Gmail says I got, two-factor authentication. We're perfect. We're nowhere close. And I think as a small business, I didn't know what I didn't know.
Right.
And that's, I think, a big concern is finding people you trust to help point you in the right direction. And I think that's a big key. Now, CMMC doesn't exist aside from in a rule that's not as an interim rule, but it is not anything they can truly put and say, you must adhere to this today in a contract. It doesn't exist in that form. It will, but we're still, I think everyone's trying to figure out what's it gonna look like.
Right, and I think that that's kind of been where a lot of the confusion has stemmed from. Even NIST 800-171, the Senate Small Business Committee did a hearing on it in, if my memory serves me right, around 2017. And most people sat in the room going, I had no idea what this was because of the self-attestation, right? Like you assume that I have this covered, and you're already trying to meet all these requirements. I think that's why this has been a very large push and drumbeat from DoD, has been trying to capture those, was it 300,000, 350,000 industrial-based businesses, but then it's been confusing to, along the way, keep changing everything and keep making everything fluid, and that's one of the problems that we continually get raised. I want to get someone else who had raised his hand before I ask John a question. Yes.
I was interested from a contracting officer perspective, how are you all looking at the SPRS scores at this point? Is it just to have a number in checking the box, or are you evaluating that in terms of one score being better than the other, or as a reflection of someone's cyber capability?
And can you, before you answer, tell everyone what SPRS is?
Part of the interim rule, clause 7019, requires all defense contractors to put in a self-attested score for 800-171 that contracting officers are supposed to review before providing an award.
Thank you.
So right now, at this very point in time, from my understanding, would be, we would be doing it as a yes, no, basically. We would not be saying contractor A has higher, greater cybersecurity than contractor B, C, D, or E, unless we were to put that in the actual evaluation metrics. That could change down the road, but right now it's mainly basically a yes, no scenario where basically just like any other clause, if we're going to put that in there as a minimum technical acceptability factor, you're basically just going to be, you're either going to have acceptable or not acceptable, but we're not going to weigh you against your partner, your other competitive company, and it's just, you have to have that to be available for the award is the way it would look in my understanding if we were to go down that road.
Yeah, like almost like a responsibility
Yeah.
factor, that you
Yeah.
would maybe potentially wouldn't be considered a responsible contractor for the award if you were, but we've had several clients that have self-scored and posted scores well in the negative. So, I do, that's a great question. I was anxious to hear the answer too. Like, what is the practical side of that these days? You know, I mean, how is that being used? And as a protest lawyer, I also think like, well, how could this be used in challenging decisions? You know, and that database though is not publicly available amongst industry, right? Like the government can see it, but we can't look up a company's score.
And Kyle, is that just within Marine Corps Systems Command, or do you know, is that a
that's
DoD
just
wide?
that's a general understanding that I would have as far as that would
Okay.
go. Now, I don't know where each and every specific DoD agency is at in their planning for CMMC and where it's going to come and when it's going to come. As far as scoring goes, though, I would just basically assume it's kind of like any other scoring system. I mean, you know, we can, to give you a comparison, we could look at your CPARS data, for example, and we could look at your safety score for construction contracts, for those of you familiar with that. And we may want them to have a minimum safety score for construction to have, you know, just to make sure they got minimum of that. But we're not going to say this guy's safer than that guy unless we actually put that in the evaluation factors of, you know, and then you actually have to write your proposal to those evaluation factors.
Our insurers already do that.
I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do. And with cybersecurity insurances, they may want him doing that down the road, to be honest, but that's not official yet. So.
I know we've touched briefly, sorry, Michael, were you going to say something? Go
Yeah, I
for
was
it.
just going to ask the audience, how many business owners here that are not IT professionals have gone and filled out or tried to fill out your own SPRS scores? How many of you did like I did and looked at it and had no clue what you were filling out? And that's the biggest problem that we face as well, is you read through that, and I think out of the first 5 pages, I was able to fill out about 5 or 6 of the total 33 questions that were there. I didn't
Right.
understand it enough to go ahead and make a self-assessment. And I know I've got pretty good security, and it's probably takes care of a lot of those things in the SPR score, but I couldn't answer that I have them or not. And I think that's something that's an issue. This is written not for the business owners.
Yep.
It's
Right.
written for the IT professionals. And that's an issue I think the DoD needs to address as well, is they are not providing enough guidance to us on how to actually answer it without going and spending thousands and thousands of dollars to have somebody else come in and answer the questions for us.
And I believe that is part of the antithesis of what they are trying to do with Project Spectrum at that level. And I know as they bring in the PTAC office is currently going through a roll into the DoD OSBP office. So I know eventually Mr. Mitha, the new SES over there, his plan is to have PTACs have that skill set and have that ability to help out with that intro process. I'm not sure where he's at in that planning stage yet. I just know he's talked to that in some cursory discussions at some of the events I've been to.
Now, has the DoD actually agreed to fund those bodies within the PTAC? Because those can't be just a standard.
That's working. That's
Okay,
from my
so
understanding.
that's the big issue.
Yeah.
The guidance to transition was published a few NDAs ago, so the guidance has been there for over an administration already. So they are currently in the process of actually implementing that stuff. I believe it's going to happen either later on, we'll say next fiscal year sometime, because later on this fiscal year is already almost over. So.
Yeah, because they're going to need the money, obviously,
Yeah.
to hire IT professionals to help guide us on
Yes.
what we're supposed to be doing.
And that's something that may wind up coming up in congressional discussions or something. Right now, I
Correct.
just know the PTAC person that is currently your go-to for general stuff would come over under Farouk, and he'd have more control to delegate and direct and put DoD level initiatives versus just nothing against DLA, but versus it being underneath somebody that's underneath. So
Right.
it will take out that middle layer, so to speak, and give a little bit more freedom to delegate and hopefully structure funding accordingly if available.
Well, and I think that touches on the multiple funding issues that from an advocacy side that we've been working on. One of them that we've been saying for the past few years has been, if you're going to roll this out, if you're going to make things that obviously like a non-IT professional can't read, but you're telling me it's only going to cost me $5,000 to be, level 1, ready to go, I'm all set, which hasn't been the case. There needs to be either people at DOD or funding, through PTAX. They don't have the expertise right now to do that. So I'm glad to see that there's progress being made in there, and I know that in the Senate there's been a big push to have, there are a couple cyber bills that didn't make it through last session with that funding, but I know it's frustrating from an industry perspective of this has kept moving full steam ahead, and those resources are now kind of showing up, dribbling out after the fact. I know we also touched on cost in kind of a couple different ways. One of the things I wanted to highlight that Michael brought up in his testimony is he was saying that while there's all this, cost data and people are trying to figure out what it costs to get ready, the actual certification costs are unclear, right? So at the current moment, the third-party assessor could technically charge you kind of whatever they want. There aren't any guardrails. So one of the things we've been advocating for through the council and through a secure supply chain consortium that we've stood up of companies that are, part of this CMMC ecosystem to give us that advocacy input is that there should be some guardrails so that you're not then spending on a certification every 3 years, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 for someone to come out, for them to stay in a hotel. I mean, I've heard various scenarios of what that might cost, so that's something else that was raised in the hearing. I want to ask you, John, because we've talked a lot about cost, we talked about the prime sub relationship and the level flow down that might be an issue. Are there any other things that either you brought up in your testimony or that you've heard from your clients that are kind of the biggest issues facing small businesses right now with regards to CMMC?
Well, I think that one other avenue to addressing the cost, the investment issue that Michael's describing is that there are mentor-protege programs, right? I'm sure everyone's aware, and the SBA's mentor-protege program is fantastic. I don't know how many of you, by show of hands, or participate in the SBA mentor-protege program. So
I'm really interested. If
Yeah.
you are, can you raise your hand?
just a couple.
Got it,
So
okay,
there
thank
are
you.
a lot of other potential protege candidates here. Obviously, it takes two to tango, so you need a mentor, but that program can be used to provide the protege with various forms of assistance, including technical assistance and financial assistance. So I've been making, this is more of an ad hoc push amongst our client base, that if you're in a mentor-protege relationship or considering one, lean on your mentor for the resources and or technical know-how to help you get ready for whatever the cybersecurity requirements are that apply to you based on the work that you do. Those relationships, that program is there and I think can be leveraged exactly for this purpose. The DoD also has a mentor-protege program, which I think, and I don't know to what extent it is currently being leveraged. Just anecdotally, based on our clients, I would say we could be using that program more, just like the SBA's program, to try to improve the cyber readiness of our small businesses. So I think that not so much a concern that I've heard, maybe more so an opportunity to look at using those mentor-protege programs.
Did you also mention in your testimony something around JVs, correct?
Yeah, and this is, I think, somewhat of a TBD how it'll work out, but there's an FAQ on one of the CMMC websites right now that says that joint ventures will need to have their own CMMC, and that doesn't make any sense, and I think
It's like the FCL issue, the facility clearance
right,
issue right
and
now,
I'm
yes.
optimistic that at the end of this rainbow, they're going to back off of that, and that the CMMC requirement for a particular contract will be satisfied based on the member companies in the JV. And if there's one company that's going to handle the CUI, they would need level 3, and maybe the other JV partner would be okay at a level 1. To make the joint venture itself go through this certification process when the joint venture is a limited purpose, no
Right.
employees, it doesn't make sense. And Lizzie mentioned the facility clearance. I mean, we just got a great ruling from the GAO about a week ago on that, that confirms regulations that SBA has put in place. The Hill and SBA have been doing a lot to try to improve how joint ventures are treated in evaluations. They have some rules now that are very impactful for how agencies are supposed to evaluate both companies in the joint venture in the aggregate, as opposed to forcing the protege to have everything or forcing the JV to have it. And so I think we're kind of like, one by one, we're knocking off these ways that agencies would maybe not treat JVs the way that they should be, facility security clearances being the latest example, and I think CMMC is going to have to be next, because it just won't make sense to make JVs go get their own CMMC.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a couple other questions, but I saw a few hands that I want to. Yes, Lori.
Hi, Lori Dillon from the HubZone program. First of all, yay to the mentor protege program. Good that you're out there, fighting for those kinds of changes. They're nuanced, very nuanced, but so critical to the success of that program. And that program is such an opportunity for HubZone firms. So kudos to you and glad to hear that. So just another thing on the resources available in addition to the PTACs and what may be happening there. In SBA or SBDCs, which is a huge nationwide network, have also been anointed as the cyber experts within our vast resource partner network. So if you have an SBDC in your community, well, you do have an SBDC in your community. If you're not aware of it, look them up. They can do so on our website, Small Business Development Centers, and they are each gearing up to have that cyber expertise, and with it, the CMMC expertise. May not be there in your community quite yet, but also something that we're working towards growing as well.
That's good to know. And so they are being trained through DoD or through whatever kind of internal government to understand how to get ready, or can they connect you with people yet who can help you?
Exactly, each network will be doing, and if they're unified in their approach, we haven't seen that yet.
Got it,
So
okay.
we're working towards that, but there's actually been some language in Congress that sort of, and there's something floating around in one of the bills that calls them the sort of the cyber.
Okay.
In the Senate, yep.
Yeah,
Mhm.
put some resources towards that hopefully as well. So that the idea being that there will be a unified network across the country that has expertise on all things cyber for small businesses, and we assume and hope that would also include CMMC.
And this has really been a pet project for Senator Marco Rubio, who's a Republican from Florida, former chair of the Senate Small Business Committee. He's still on the committee, he's just not chair. And I know that they're looking to get those bills through potentially in this National Defense Authorization Act that really designates and also gives then funding to SBDCs to do this, although I'm thrilled to hear that this is kind of happening, which is not surprising, without congressional direction. So thank you, SBA, that's fantastic. Thank you, Lori.
Question, Lori, your SBDCs, aren't they typically associated with universities?
The grants tend to go through universities, but they are their own organization. They're their own
Correct.
sort of nonprofit organizations that they get funding from multiple sources.
They're resource
But
partners.
Could funding come through the universities to set that up?
Could funding come from the universities to help set that
Well,
up?
have a flow through the universities that they're, almost all of them have a computer science program. They would have the skill
I would
set.
hope that that's how the SBDCs are using that relationship with the universities to gain that status nationwide, to leverage that relationship.
But would that make it easier to get funding? That's all I'm making up.
I mean, that may play into it, and
That's a good observation.
and also
Yes, go ahead.
to note, anything that affects industry, there are contracts given to universities, and there are grants and everything else. So if that stuff starts affecting contracts given to all of you, that stuff could easily fall into the contracts for the university. So the university will have to acquire the internal expertise for the university to comply. And I can tell you from having a biologist run a subcontract plan one time, it's very interesting when you deal with a university.
Very interesting. Yes, did you have a comment on that?
To add in on the PTAC conversation, I know at the state level, programs are ramping
Right.
up. Virginia's Gen Ed program, Maryland has Maryland Engineering or MEP program. Those are great programs to go to start. They do have funding available to start with assessments and to start with some of the remediation. Definitely look up what you do in your states, because they do have some really great programs there.
Absolutely. Thank you for, that's a good point. I forgot to mention that. Yes.
So just a quick comment on this, right? So level 1 is not the same as secure. And so, and I'm gonna tell you, until 2012, I was the DICE director. And
Can you tell everyone what DICE is?
it's a DoD DIB collaborative information sharing environment.
Thank you.
And I was the GS-15 in charge. And I basically built that, you know, that operational back end, and I let the politicians, my bosses, the SESs, do their thing. I was knee-deep involved in doing the 800-171 work. And that, you know, the intent there was to say that we could stratify the types of security that need to be placed in small companies like Mike's, right? So you need to have firewalls and endpoints, maybe some training, awareness, two-factor authentication. And that's gonna knock down 70% of the threats that are gonna come at your door. The other things were built into that 800-171 and the ensuing level 3 so that companies could go back and start tracking the movement of data. It's almost a full-on zero trust model. And except without the automation. And those things were used because at the time about 65% of critical suppliers, top 10,000 critical suppliers, had less than 25 people.
Right.
And so the intent was, let's figure out what the stratified risk looks like, put in those 3 or 4 or 5 controls, show us that you've done that. A firewall you can buy for $2,000. Commercial grade firewall, right? Don't go buy a Meraki or a Sonic Wall or something off the shelf at Best Buy. But you could buy a good firewall for about $2,000 and put those other things in place for very little, and then monitor it out, if chosen to do so, for a few $100s a month. That's totally affordable by any small company.
Right.
But level 3 as a whole, and NIST 800-171, when you have to swallow that entire elephant, it's not gonna work.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's been missing is a lot of that communication of what it is, what's supposed to be, and then also the costs associated, right? Which is why I am encouraged that SBA has moved forward in trying to get some of that information out through their resource partners now. Well, it seems like someone has to go. Through their resource partners. No worries. Their resource, that was you. No, resource partners right now. But I think that that's a good point of highlighting that there are some solutions, but being able to get to those has been, I know, very challenging. Kyle, I want to ask you, thinking now future tense, what do you see, you know, as either, as you move forward in this process from the government side, the biggest issues, and also what have you found encouraging during this process?
So the encouraging things I've found have been the openness to be willing to discuss this and actually be proactive on trying to plan and trying to subset for this. I can say at Syscom, we're very aware of the supply chain and the cyber issues, probably due to the nature of what we do and what we buy in a lot of cases. But at the same time, many agencies are trying to be as proactive as they can and try to be as communicative as they can with their industry counterparts and industry partners. Now, some of the things that I see concerning are really having the training to understand, should this contract be level 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 at the program level or at the contracting officer level? What is the real difference between 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5? Because your contract officer most of the time is not an IT specialist.
Right.
So they're going to deal with the same issues that the gentleman over here said where, hey, can you tell me how many of you aren't IT and try to fill out this form? It's a question I would have, how many contracting officers can fill out that form, to be honest with you, if they tried to do it from the other side. So that's some things that are going to have to be addressed. There's going to have to be training provided at multiple levels, I would say, in order for this thing to truly take off and truly be implemented. So those are some things I would say that need to be considered and need to be aware. And also PMs and CORs to manage it on the back end, because once this stuff's in place, it's not just I sign, it's all gravy now that I signed something. No, there's also the side of managing it on the back end once you have the contract, making sure, oh, you did get hit by an attack. Okay, this is what we did to do all this and everything else. So,
Kyle, do you know if there has been a push yet or any discussions around creating that type of education, either through DAU, which is Defense Acquisition University, or some other mechanism?
So there's been talk on supply chain risk management models discussed. Some agencies are looking at funding education programs for their employees to take those things. DAU has done some seminars in that arena, and I believe they do have a few professors that are working that from that standpoint. I'm not sure if they've actually implemented anything, I know they haven't implemented any full-on in-person type classes, of course, because DAUs would do mostly virtual right now with COVID, but
Right.
they may be looking at putting some CLCs or CLM, basically continuous learning courses and continuous learning modules in place to at least have the baseline there. It would probably be a funding discussion and a DAU instructor-led discussion as to whether they would implement a full-on SCRM type certification or program level. I know DAU's been looking at remodeling their education structure for a lot more certification versus just like specialization, so that the people working will have a more diverse background and be able to handle various initiatives to include cybersecurity amongst others across multiple roles that they may be working on.
Definitely, and I know that, we'll be interested to follow that as the process moves forward. I know that has also been, thank you for bringing that up, a pain point for businesses from both the, prime to sub levels, but also do the, KOs know exactly what they're doing, or, is there a mechanism if you don't agree? Or I know that has kind of been a point of contention thus far. I wanted to check if there are any more questions. Yes.
Yes, so as Tom mentioned, that's not public information once it goes in the servers and they upload it. So if our subs are doing that, we're taking their word for it. Because there's really nothing they can provide to us with a score or for us to validate that. We're going to be audited on that in the future. Is there a way that can then become more public or put into the system for work management? I mean, it feels like it's going to be, if virtually everybody should be a level 1. How can that become more visible to us? Because a lot of the legwork for a lot of the primes is getting in touch with every supplier, educating them, this is me. And then have you done it? And then what do we have? It's kind of Scout's honor if you did it. So that's definitely a roadblock for us. And then at the same time, makes things a lot faster and easier if we can all look it up in a centralized location. That's what's great about seeing. So, are there plans for that?
I have not seen anything come down for plans like that, I will say. Now, I do like your idea, and I would say it should be brought up, because a centralized repository of all that information for you to look up the subs is valuable, and a lot of the information that you currently do look up to validate your subs is in SAM. Now, the question I would have for SAM would be the security level and the security level of the information being put in there, just to make sure the system is meeting the maintenance and caveat of basically protecting the information that's being put in there is at the right level for whatever system that we may be giving somebody access to authorize, and we may be storing data in from a government standpoint.
And
Yeah,
I remember that one of the issues John actually first brought up a long time ago that he probably doesn't remember telling me was him saying, wait, make sure that companies aren't advertising their CMMC level, because you're just telling those that might want to get into your systems exactly your level of security. So to Kyle's point, it would need to be some type of secure portal, but that's a really great idea. Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's probably of limited usefulness, truthfully, because ultimately that's going to be replaced with CMMC. And so it's really an interim step that we're doing this self-scoring. So I guess, it would certainly be useful now in this period before CMMC is actually online. But the willingness to implement something like that probably just wouldn't be there, because by the time that happens, we might be in the CMMC world. I mean, the primes, what I'm seeing is they're, like they are in many other contexts, requiring full audit and inspection rights and requirements to demonstrate whatever is necessary in their eyes, compliance. So I think, through your agreements with the subcontractors, you're, giving yourself mechanisms to check. But you're right that ultimately what you're checking is the Scout's honor that we did what we're supposed to do. But, that's the case in so many other contexts as well. So that's why the pressure then shifts to the risk shifting provisions and indemnification rights and what's the liability if something goes wrong and show me your insurance. There are a lot more gating issues now to be able to be in the ecosystem of many primes, and I think it's to deal with, frankly, the unknowns and the risks at the heart of what you're asking about there.
So just to add on that, when we get to that CMMC thing, are you saying that's where will be publishable, that we can access that, or? is that
Well,
still-
I'm not sure that it'll be published or not, but that's I would imagine there'll be, if it's not literally a certificate you can show the prime, there'll be some
Something.
record of the fact that the primes would say, show me your certificate, just like HubZone firms,
Yeah.
are unique amongst small businesses, that you have to show the prime your HubZone certification number so that the prime can take credit for you. So I think it'll be something like that.
Yeah,
If it's not public, and I don't know that it wouldn't be, but
yeah, I mean, I would think I would agree with him.
Awesome, yes.
Just a comment on that question. Isn't that what the purpose of the SSP is, when you have that kind of relationship, like you can ask your sub, to see their SSP to understand better where they are in their NIST compliance?
I mean, I think as a prime, if you had that right under your contract with your sub, that these audit and inspection rights, which are generally drafted pretty broadly, if it included the right to take a peek at your subcontractor's SSP, that would certainly be a pretty good clue in terms of, where they are with their self-scoring.
Because I thought the POAM was, meant to be kept private, but the SSP, the purpose of that was like a high-level summary of your progress and so forth, and the purpose of it, which I may be wrong, was for these kind of relationships so that you could evaluate a sub's, level of compliance.
I don't think I would describe the SSP
And SSP stands for?
System Security Plan.
Thank
I don't
you.
think I would describe the purpose of the SSP the way that you are, but I think it could be used in the way that you're suggesting. I think the purpose of the SSP is internal for the organization, to have the processes and procedures in place it needs to accomplish its security objectives, and whether it's the NIST 800-171 or whatever it might be. But I think a prime in sort of assessing whether they want to have a particular vendor in their ecosystem, I could see the quality or whether it even exists, assessment of an SSP by their vendor might be part of what they would want to look at.
Marshall, did you have something?
Yeah, it was something just you said triggered, and I'm going, oh my. Another thing I didn't think about. When you self-report, when you have an incident, and you report it, then what are the contract liabilities and performance and schedule? And can you be walled off and kicked off because you happen to be the one that somebody looked at and said, you're the one today I'm going after?
Mm-hmm.
Is that dealt with in any of the conversations? I'm like, okay, we got this whole thing down. Now we have an incident. Now what? I haven't heard anybody talk to me about anything like that. Now I'm sitting there going, oh my God, another thing.
Well, if the prime flowed the 7012 clause down to you and it applies to you because you have CUI in your network, then you would be subject to the rapid reporting requirements up to your prime that the prime is subject to. I think, again, this just comes back to, and again, I realize it's easy for me to say, harder for you to do as subs, when you're working with primes, because the leverage is oftentimes not in your favor, but it comes down to the terms of the agreements, and the agreements take different shapes and sizes in terms of what the ramifications would be for you as a member of the team if it was your network that experienced a breach. And I think that could be up to and including getting the boot off of the project, absolutely. But it would, if you came to me and said that my prime is threatening to give me the boot from this project because I have an incident, I would say, show me your subcontract, and we'll see if they can give you the boot or not. So it really is going to come down to, and we're seeing a lot more focus on teaming agreements and subcontracts and joint venture agreements in terms of risk shifting and handling worst case scenario events from a cyber perspective, because it's just a much more prevalent issue these days.
I haven't seen anything along those lines.
Well, most of those contracts, though, will end up having a very important word in them, and that's negligence. Okay, and so that is really where it comes down to. If you're negligent because you didn't put the stuff in place you were supposed to, then your chance of getting kicked off the contract are probably pretty high. That's where John's talking about how he needs to look at the contract.
Yep.
If they can't prove negligence, then they're gonna have a lot harder time
Yeah.
saying, well, hold it, it's all your fault.
Then
If
it
you
would-
put in everything in place, then they're gonna look and say, well, you did everything possible you could, and you just happen to be the one
Yeah.
that the best hacker in the world got into.
Yeah, that'd be a similar scenario as to storms or hurricanes right now, basically determining the act of God. Now, you'd have to litigate and everything, but, you know.
Yeah.
I know we're running up against time, so I just wanted to leave, yes, you have been raising your hand for a while. Go ahead. You'll be my last one.
You've referenced the NIST requirements. Could you please reference ISO 27001, how it can be used, and if a company is certified, to what level will they meet and demonstrate compliance to?
That's beyond my expertise.
Michael?
Yeah, no, it's same here. I mean, the NIST the ISO requirements, I think, have been a moving target, is probably the best way to put it. They've talked about CMMC AB supposed to being ISO compliant. The AB is not ISO compliant either. So nobody's really holding anything to the fire, anyone's feet to the fire with regards to anything compliant with ISO at this point in time. And so I wouldn't count on ISO being really the driving factor at this point of anything until they come out with more clarity.
Relative to ISO, I think there's some mappings between the CMMC requirements and the ISO requirements, so that helps you kind of get there. There was talk early in the spring about reciprocity. I don't think that's gone anywhere.
I don't think so.
No.
It has.
No, that's all I was going to add, was that reciprocity is, I don't think that's going to happen.
That was a rumor that was
Yeah.
going on, but I
Yeah.
But it hasn't happened, exactly.
It was in some of the town halls, but
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think it just didn't get off the
Yeah.
ground. It was
Yeah.
a nice idea, but I
think
don't,
you can do some mapping to help at least start to understand where you got coverage.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, and that brings up an important point where you brought up reciprocity, and I think that we're seeing out there in general, and one of the fears is most of us do business with multiple agencies. What reciprocity is there going to be between their versions of CMMC, whatever they may call it, and the DoD's CMMC? And I think that's going to become a big issue, making sure that there is reciprocity across
Yes.
the agencies, because without it, we may have 7 assessments. How many of us can afford
Yeah.
1, let alone 7?
And I believe the ultimate goal is for DODs to become the industry standard. Now, I don't want to try predicting the future and what will become because things change.
Yeah.
Before we get to final thoughts, I have two things I wanted to point out. One is if you have questions, Kyle's boss is going to be doing, your boss,
Not my boss, but my colleague.
colleague, apologies. His colleague is going to be
just
doing
got promoted.
a CMMC, I'm sorry, Kyle, long day. A CMMC FAQ, and Michelle just walked away, I believe, on the
16th.
16th. I think my dates are all mixed up. Apologies. If you have some burning questions, please email either the info@hubzonecouncil.org or my email is esullivan@madisonservicesgroup.com, and Michelle will send that out after the summit concludes. But I'm going to be asking him these questions, so I would love to get any further thoughts or comments or questions that I can ask Kyle's counterpart. The second thing is, as a component of the HubZone Council, we are launching a secure supply chain consortium. This is really for companies that want to be involved in the policy side of all of these decisions being made, meaning, as an advocacy team, instead of having to go to Michelle and our other clients all the time to try and find the companies like you that are going through this, that can give us the input, give us the feedback, give us the ideas of what Congress or DOD or the other agencies or SBA can be doing. We really want to create that brain trust and that advocacy force. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the Secure Supply Chain Consortium, and we have some papers that Michelle is holding up, and we're really excited about it. So final thoughts, any burning last thoughts, kind of tips you want to leave the audience with? Kyle, I'll start with you.
Nothing too much. Mainly, just, the world we live in, cybersecurity is a necessity, so be aware of what your surroundings are, be aware of what's going on. Whether you're working for DoD or working for a commercial company, it plays in there. Understanding your supply chain is becoming a lot bigger deal. So I know trying to figure out who the 25th tier contractor is probably not doable, but try to be aware of what's going on and what you're doing with your contract. That is a very big scenario. As you can see, there's been, of course, your national news incidents that have hit in recent year, and also there's other things that you don't hear about out there, but it's becoming a very prevalent factor out there and has been for a while now. So that's, of course, always going to be driving the decisions in that arena. And what we're doing is we're hoping to create a better environment for the industrial base to have a more secure contracting and ultimately improve our industrial base in the changing world we live in. So, always great to hear your thoughts and always great to see what industry's thinking. And any questions, et cetera, feel free to reach out. Also, feel free to talk to your congresspeople.
Thank you for that, Michael.
Pretty much secure yourselves. If you are unsure of whether you have enough security now, get some type of assessment done by somebody you trust. And I think that's a key component right now. There are tens of thousands of companies out there. You probably all have seen the emails of, if you don't have CMMC next week, you're not going to get a government contract. That kind of fear-mongering that gets put out into everybody's emails on a daily basis. Find companies that you can trust. Check with your friends in the industry, check with others that have had good experiences. There's great companies out there, and there's going to be companies out there that are horrible. There was a company advertising CMMC compliance out of India. Okay, sorry folks, that isn't happening. So that would be my advice.
Find someone you trust. John, we'll end with you.
I echo what both of these guys just said. I think, we had a good show of hands for folks that are already well out of the gate preparing for CMMC. So my main comment may not apply to you all as much as it does to small businesses in general, which is not to have your head in the sand when it comes to cybersecurity. And I say cybersecurity as opposed to CMMC because there's a lot of shots being taken at CMMC, some of which are legitimate. It's been slow to roll out, and I think the end game is still hazy, but the government's focus on cybersecurity isn't going anywhere. And that is just good business practices, even if you were a purely commercial firm. You need to be mindful of this, you not have your head in the sand. It won't be a one-size-fits-all approach, I hope, and I hope we'll have enough flexibility for the truly small firms to not be cut out of the government market. But everyone needs to be paying attention to it, and so I appreciate you all coming here today to hear us chat about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it, and please join me in thanking our panelists today. Thank you, everyone.